Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. This is the second in a series that I'm calling Making the 20s Roll, or ways to start out the decade in a way that will provide a vibrant shot in the arm of our civilization and our culture. And today I'm going to focus on what I had actually originally planned on focusing on, but is uniquely and timely and appropriate given that in the last week we had literally an armed insurrection of Trump toadies storm the capital of the Republic in something that is quite frankly unprecedented in the United States of America. And the original topic that I had planned to discuss was twofold, but still boils down to the same thing, which is how to get rid of swine, right? How to get rid of people who think that civil war and insurrection is a great idea and constantly threatening violence and how well armed they are and have no interest in firearms as a legitimate need for self-defense or sportsmanship or even hunting, but are in fact keeping firearms not even for a well-regulated militia to preserve the standards of living for their local community, but as a cudgel to terrify the left and justify white supremacy, which is, as more time goes on, more and more apparent that is really, at the end of the day, what a significant chunk of the right in this country stands for. I'm not saying that everyone on the right is a swine. I'm not saying that everyone on the right is a fascist. I'm not saying that everyone who belongs to the National Rifle Association is a gun fetishist. I am saying that the vast majority of them are. At this point, if you still support Donald Trump as a president and think that he did a good job, then you are a problem for not just the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, but the entire world and every sapient creature on this planet that doesn't even have to be a human being. Hell, you're a threat to the entire freaking galaxy because eventually Elon Musk is going to make us a multi-planet civilization, and we could potentially spread our toxic fascist ideals to other civilizations and do to potentially sapient species in other star systems what we did to the Native Americans in the Spanish and European conquest of the New World. So with that in mind, let's discuss a couple of things that we can do to preserve civilization and make the Republican Party go away. I'm going to start with the first part of this, which is how to survive and then how to thrive, right? So the first part is how to thrive. There are two facts that you need to understand about the American political system if you're going to be realistic about it. The first one is that due to the math of how the American federal system works, it is currently mathematically possible for only two parties to thrive. That is not to say that I do not support the right of third parties to exist. I now am a fan of parliaments that allow small parties to thrive, that allow governing coalitions of multiple parties to come together to negotiate a government that forms not only coalitions and bridge building, but allows them to actually govern. And parliaments are not perfect, but they are certainly far more functional than our bicameral legislature combined with the abomination that is the imperial presidency of the United States. And at the same time, until we get a new constitution, we have to maintain liberty long enough to reboot the Constitution. And I talk about a lot of things that we can do to fix things in the system. in 11 Fixes for Broken Everything. But what I'm about to discuss is much, much, much simpler. It's realpolitik. And that is, you have to understand, the second thing you have to understand, besides the fact that mathematically we can only have two parties in the current system, is that the Democratic Party, as it exists, is basically a big tent. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to understand the nature of a big tent party. Confederations do not work. They don't work. It doesn't work for the EU. It didn't work for the Confederacy. It didn't work for the Athenian League. A bunch of like-minded individuals that have a broad, ungovernable alliance with no ability to centralize is going to go nowhere. Now, a lot of cynical people, particularly progressives, will point out that the Democratic Party can actually be very centralized, and is in the Democratic National Committee, but they're mainly centralized in preserving the power of centrists, right? For power unto itself. And that is an unsustainable situation. As the Republican Party gets crazier and crazier and crazier, the need for a broad coalition, the broadest possible coalition, to come together is stronger now than it's ever been. And if you're going to be a party, you should be the best at that thing you can be, right? In other words, I'm a progressive. And if we had a system that allowed me to join the Green Party or the Progressive Party or the Far Left Party or the Socialist Party, I'd be all for it. Now, I am not a socialist. And at the end of the day, I'm not even sure I'm really on the far left. I'm a pragmatist. My political philosophy is neutral good, which is the most good for the most people in a way that doesn't significantly harm the minority. But right now, the best place to be neutral good is on the far left, because they not only get things done, but they actually want to help people instead of just incrementally changing things a little bit at a time. Things are so messed up right now that incremental change is just not going to work. But the fact of the matter is that we are stuck with the Democratic Party. You can rail against our system all you want, but the fact is that if we don't have a functional Democratic Party, we got nothing. Because there's this thing called Duviger's Law, which basically mathematically shows what is historically obvious to anyone that understands the history of the United States, especially the political history of the United States, which is that third parties do not work. They do not work. Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of the most vibrant, dynamic, charismatic people to ever sit in the White House, tried to form a third party called the Boom Moose Party, and he couldn't do it. And the reason he couldn't do it is Duviger's Law. Look it up. But bottom line is that in the American system, you can only have two freaking parties. Now, you can have a party implode like the Whig Party did, and that the Republican Party hopefully will, and replace it with something else. But you're basically, in our current system, only going to have two parties. And if we're going to reboot the Constitution, we have to have a president who is willing and able to allow that to happen. And if another Republican gets elected, it won't. And more than likely, we won't have another election. So if that's the case, then how does the big tent Democratic Party be the best big tent party that it can possibly be, and still represent the interests of so many different segments of the population? Because the bigger it gets, the less it has a definition. Right now, its primary definition is, we're not the crazy people. And that's literally 50% of what they sell. Now, they do have some progressive messages. Most of the other messages that the Democratic Party has are progressive or, well, look, we're not the crazy people. You know, if you're in the center or the center-right, your choices are vote as an independent for a Democrat, not vote, which is effectively like voting for a Republican, or join a third party and get nowhere because of Duviger's Law. And the thing is that the people in charge of the Democratic Party want a big coalition because they want to be in charge, and also they're terrified of the Republicans, justifiably. So they want as big a coalition as possible. But more and more of the central Democratic leadership are starting to realize that they also have to, they can no longer ignore the progressives, because it's the progressives and their message that helped to form the coalition in Georgia that allowed the two senators to win. And appealing to the base was a more successful method of winning than a mealy-mouthed centrist blue dog piece of crap that hasn't been elected in 20 years in the South. And there's a reason for that, because people aren't going to want to vote for that. You're not going to want to, when you're working 80 hours a week, you're not going to suddenly take 3 buses to go to a gerrymandered, suppressed 9-hour line to vote for a piece of crap. You're just not. And the Democratic Party is starting to realize that. But the thing is that we can do better. We can reach out to the Libertarians and the Greens and every other small party. And there's one simple thing that the Democratic Party can do to get them to temporarily form an alliance to destroy, and I don't mean violently destroy, but I mean metaphorically destroy the Republican Party. And the way to do it is ranked choice voting, not only for the federal government, but at every local level. What ranked choice voting is, and by the way, it is successfully implemented in many democracies and in the state of Maine, and has worked very well. And what it is it's basically an automatic instant runoff, in the sense that instead of voting for just one candidate, you do on a Scantron what every student has ever done and fill out multiple dots for multiple candidates. So in other words, you get to choose not just who you vote for the office of president, but who your second choice is, right? In other words, I want to vote for the green guy, but I know that if I do, I'm throwing my vote away due to Duviger's law. So I have to vote for either a Democrat or allow a psycho-Republican to win. And Maine put this in place because they had a crazy lunatic governor, and they got sick of it. Now, Maine also reelected Susan Collins, so you're not going to hear me talk about how absolutely amazing the people of Maine are. But they got one good idea, and it's a good idea, and it's working. And the thing you have to understand is, if we don't have something that is going to make somebody who is disaffected with the two-party system have a reason to swallow their bile and their hatred of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party in an alliance against the Republican Party, then you're going to have 5 to 15% of the electorate that could be voting to stop fascists not vote out of protest, or continue to essentially effectively throw their vote away for a non-two-party system. I understand the people who are disaffected with the two-party system. But math doesn't care about your feelings. Math doesn't care about the fact that the Republicans are fascists. Math is math. Math is what it is. And Duviger's law says that as long as our current system is organized the way it is, two parties are it. That's just it, right? I'm all in favor of a constitution that has a fairer system, a more democratic system, and a more multi-party system. Personally, I think a parliament's the way to go, but there's a lot of different ways we could do it. But in our current system, the way it's currently legislated, two parties are it. But if we had ranked choice federal voting, you would still effectively have only two parties, but it would be much easier at a local level to have a broader number of independents and small parties. It would still be very skewed in our current system, but it would still be better than it is now. And if the Democratic Party doesn't have anything to offer these voters who are disaffected with them, then they aren't being a big tent, right? They're trying to wield this ridiculous coalition of the far left and the center right. And it does not work, and it will not work. It's unsustainable. And while people do have a legitimate continuing fear of the Trump family or Trump clones, and will for some time, they also have very short memories. And more importantly, they will forget that we were literally days away from an armed revolt, and they'll dismiss it in their minds, and they'll say, well, it wasn't that bad, or nah, that wasn't really going to happen, or no, the military wouldn't let that happen. None of these things are true. We had a real, legitimate risk of an actual coup in this country. We came last Wednesday closer to an actual coup than we have ever had. And that risk is still there as long as Trump is alive and free, and as long as his family is alive and free, and as long as the Republican Party is what it is. And that's not going to change anytime soon. And we have to accept that reality. And more importantly, the people who must accept that reality are the politicians that run the Democratic Party. And if they don't wake up and offer the people who could be helping us vote to keep the Republicans out of power something to bring them to the table, they won't vote for the Democratic Party. They will not. Have a conversation with somebody who supports the Libertarians or the Greens or any other third party, and there is nothing that will convince them to vote for the Democrats. Even if you can get them to actually admit the threat that is the Republican Party, and many of them will not, because they deny reality just as much as the Republicans do, but many of them will. Hell, many of them actually do understand Duvernay's Law, and they don't care, because it's a matter of principle for them. It's a matter of principle to not support a corrupt two-party system. And the truth is, it is corrupt. It is unfair. But their vote accomplishes nothing to actually change the system. However, if you offer them something meaningful, right? If your party suddenly supports fair elections, easy access for third parties to the ballots, fair, nonpartisan allocation of districts, and most important of all, ranked choice voting, it gives people who are not fans of the Democratic Party a reason to vote, right? Medical marijuana, and now recently legalization of marijuana, has become a way to get young people who have very justifiable cynicism for the Democratic Party to go out and vote for the Democratic Party to legalize marijuana. Well, there's only so much legalization you can do, and there's definitely a lot of low-hanging fruit there still to be pulled, but not enough to save the republic, okay? If the Democratic Party makes ranked choice voting in every city, in every state, and at the federal level, the law of the land, you're going to get potentially 10 to 15 years worth of return on that, because it's going to take that long to make it work. For people who hate the two-party system, but who are willing to vote for a party that will give the actual third party that they want to vote for a chance to help accelerate the justifiable and needed demise of the Republican Party, a nice kick in the pants to accelerate it. Now, that was the first part. It's really simple. The Democratic Party supports ranked choice voting just to preserve the republic. The second thing that I'm going to talk about in this podcast is another very simple idea, but the implementation is pretty complicated. The Koch brothers, who created the abomination that is the Tea Party, that eventually became the monstrosity that is the fascist wing of the Republican Party, which is pretty much 80% of it now, understand institutional wealth. There's a book that you may or may not have heard of, and you may not or may not even like, but there's a valuable lesson in it called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And in this book, he makes the argument that he had his actual dad who was poor and who told him things like, work hard, son, and you'll get a job and a salary and you'll retire and everything's good. And then the lessons he learned from his adopted rich dad, who viewed wealth as passive income. And the whole book talks about how you need to think that way if you're going to be rich, and that wealth is how long can you live without having to work, right? If you have enough wealth that you can live 3 months of the year without having to work, then you've got more wealth than somebody that has none, right? So the point is, in all that politicians, institutional politicians, understand power the same way. So, in other words, if you're a flash-in-the-pan, popular, charismatic leader, and you got your pet cause that's, the cause of that particular year, they'll pay attention to you. Absolutely, because every politician wants to be popular. But the successful Congress people who are reelected year after year after year, the people they really pay attention to are the coalitions of voters, right? On the left, that's unions, that's doctors, that's associations of teachers, that's coalitions of minorities who have associations that want your attention, and they're not going to want your attention just for this particular election. They're going to pay attention to what you're doing election after election after election after election. And on the right, that's the NRA, or that's corporations, the Chamber of Commerce, right? An institutional organization that exists to perpetuate electoral pressure for a particular interest. The Democrats have them and the Republicans have them. But you know who doesn't really have them? Progressives. There are some progressive institutions. There are some progressive rich people. Hollywood has a tendency to donate to causes on left, but those donations tend to be for left-leaning causes, not progressivism unto itself, right? There is no Koch equivalent of think tanks and media and I think the best example I can think of is for those who are really political junkies, there's a thing called ALEC, right, which is basically an organization on the right to draw up conservative, abominable legislation and create cookie-cutter versions of it in every state house in the country to drag the country as far to the right as they can possibly go. And they have pet state legislatures who go to these conferences and lap this stuff up. And, there are left-leaning versions of ALEC, but very few of them are actually progressive, right? They tend to be democratic. There's a democratic equivalent, but there's a progressive equivalent. And the thing is that you have to understand that if the Democratic Party is a big tent, then the progressives are just a part of that. And for the progressives to be the engine that makes that big tent go, to seize power, to control the narrative, to control the message, what progressives need are institutions like ALEC, like think tanks, and this can be done through a number of existing websites and platforms like Patreon, like Facebook, like Twitter. But nobody, as near as I can tell, is actually organizing these things. And before you say, well, why don't you organize one, Tom? I couldn't organize my way out of a paper bag. No, that's not true. I could organize these things, but I'm not charismatic, right? I'm not, I could, let me put it this way. When I was a Boy Scout, I loved the game of Capture the Flag. And I was so obsessed with this game that at a very large scout gathering called a Jamboree, I managed to convince them to have a Capture the Flag game. Only it turned out that they didn't actually have a giant Capture the Flag game with thousands and thousands of people, although they did start it out. And it was, let me tell you, it was like something out of Braveheart. It was fantastic. They had two teams on either side of the hill, and we started going towards each other. But as soon as we started, they blew this whistle, and then they turned the whole thing into a really lame exercise in forming a line and finding a supposedly crashed jet engine. And I was so upset about this that I went up onto a hill and took the flag and, for the better part of 2 or 3 hours that night, tried to, rally the people to actually play the Capture the Flag game, and stood up there on the hill with my little flag. And you know what happened? Nothing. So my hope with this podcast is to have somebody that actually could get a Capture the Flag game organized, right? My hope by putting this idea out there is that someone listening to the sound of my voice will realize that we do need passive income, passive electoral pressure for progressives. And if you think you can do that, then do it. Make it happen. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!